Greetings again, friends. Well, today I want to do a few different things. Now, what I want to start with is just thinking back about Father's Day that just occurred. But I also want to address what is coming with what we'll be talking about in Revelation. Now, I think about this also in relation to this particular month. And if you know anything about this month of June, which this is airing in, you will know that this month is a month that is considered a month for brides. Now, if you've ever looked at any bridal magazine, you might know that June has traditionally been the month for weddings or brides. Well, this year I've noticed something a bit different. Now, what I've noticed this year has been also pretty troubling to me as I've thought it through. Because I've noticed more and more businesses, mainstream businesses, are promoting this issue of pride. More and more you are seeing the emphasis on this, and probably because of the current friendliness of this American administration that is in power toward any diversity of gender and belief. Now, if we get into this subject, we could go in many different directions, but I want to think about it in reference to the video I plan to release next, which is the marriage supper of the Lamb. And in thinking of that, I thought it would be appropriate to kind of take a step back and look at this issue of marriage. And then I got to thinking about all these things with homes and fathers raising children and what happens to children and how different things influence them. And today you just have a real confusion among many young people about who they are, what their identity is. So we could go in many different directions, but I've addressed some of these things in the past. Now, I've addressed things as much as 12 years ago, almost 12 years ago in a blog article I wrote, and I want to get into this in just a few moments. But what I want to deal with in this video here is to talk about a subject that really I know you're aware of, and I don't want you to be feeling this inappropriately, but I do want you to understand and feel this if it is appropriate. So, what am I saying? Okay, well, there's all kinds of things you can look up to see that talk about emotion. And there's different views as to how many emotions there are. Some say there's 7 basic emotions, and they label it that way. I'm not going to get into all the detail of this so much. Some say there's 27 different emotions, and maybe as many as 30 or more. You can look it up yourself and see how many emotions there are. Well, I want to deal with a particular emotion here in this article, but I wanted to address it in what I see in biblical terms with different verses of Scripture that I looked up in reference to this. Now, if you haven't figured it out already, even from the thumbnail, what I am talking about today is this idea of shame. Now, you know, as I've mentioned before, that you should not want to be ashamed when you stand before Him and when you're judged by God. And this is what will be happening with believers in heaven right about this time as the marriage supper or the marriage is happening. And we'll deal with that again, as I said, in the next video. But I want to address this here, thinking about that shame and about all these things kind of coming together. So what I did is I went to my Bible program and I looked up the word shame. And lo and behold, there were 133 references to that word or derivative of that And I find that number particularly interesting because, well, you would have to look in my book to really see why that number is significant to me and I think to our understanding of God and who He is, but that is its own subject. So there were 133 references to shame. And I just was thinking about a few of these, and one of the first ones that just caught my eye was this one about fathers. And you see here in Proverbs 19:26 that, speaking of children, he who mistreats his father and chases away his mother is a son who causes shame and brings reproach. Now, any parents out there? Do your children cause you shame? Well, they could, and some of that could be because of how they've been raised. Some of it could be their own personal decisions. But it is sad when a child mistreats their father. It's not a natural thing necessarily. I'll get into that a little bit when I read this article. But that is something that I thought about in families. Now, I happen to work in a field where I see a lot of children because of working around toys more, and I get to see a lot of how children behave and how they interact with their parents or whoever's with them. And you learn a lot if you think about that and see that. And it reveals a lot too. And it makes me sad because I see how so many children end up going in a wrong direction because of how they're taught or not taught as they should be. But I see a lot of children wanting to do what their parents say. So again, I'll get into this more in just a moment, but I have another verse of what happens when children get older and how it often leads to them having a behavior bad if they're not trained properly. And Psalm 4:2 is one of those verses that stood out as I looked at that, which says, "How long, O sons of men, will you turn my glory to shame? How long will you love worthlessness and seek falsehood?" Selah. That means meditate on this. Okay, so those were a couple verses that just jumped out at me as I looked at it. And then I came to this one, and I thought about it in relation to this month, which is the bridal month, traditionally in June. And it says in Proverbs 11:2, "When pride comes, then comes shame. But with the humble is wisdom." Now, I know this here is talking about pride as in your own personal self being uplifted. But what is it that we have now in our culture that is pushing us to think of these different genders and things? One of those things that's emphasized that is maybe trying to circumvent the month of June being a month for brides is this idea of pride. Now, if you have looked at this at all, you'll see businesses are just pushing this. Programs on your phone that you may listen to music or something are trying to empower pride voices. And I could discuss this a lot, and what is good, bad, what should be done, not should be done. Maybe if you have a question, you should ask me and I can get into that more. But just to understand this is the emphasis of the LGBTQIA community. Now, I knew this more from my time working on the campuses with it being the LGBTA or LGBTQ. LGBT was the first, and then the Q was kind of added, and now we have IA, so it's more often noted as LGBTQIA. Now that stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer is the Q, or questioning is put in there as some possibility. Intersex is the I, and asexual or an ally of these ideas, is the A. So LGBTQIA. Now, this is what is being promoted by the culture, because our culture doesn't understand male and female, when Jesus said that he made them from the beginning male and female. Okay, so what's our problem now that we're so confused about our culture or our sexual identity? So that there's a whole emphasis now, changing the month of June, in their eyes it should be focused on pride. Well, there is an issue here with pride, because it is uplifting ourself and our identity instead of our Creator God who made us. And there should be shame that goes with not understanding who you are and even behaving in a way contrary to what God says should be. But I could get into this much more, and I would like to, even before I read this article. Because, friend, if you don't know the Creator God, you need to know Him. And there's lots of verses that focus on this one verse that comes originally from Isaiah 28. 16 in particular, I believe, is where that comes from. But it's quoted in the New Testament in several different places. And the one that jumped out at me was Romans 10:11, where it says, "For the Scripture says, whoever believes on Him," that is, on the Messiah, on Jesus Christ, "will not be put to shame." Okay, so if you don't want to feel shame, if you don't want to be shamed, then you need to believe on Him. Now, if you do know Him, friend, I want you to be thinking about what you will do when you meet Him. Will you be ashamed before Him? Because I address this at the end of this article I write, but there's a verse that has been really standing out to me since my time in college, and it was the verse that hit me just when I walked down the stairs one day and saw 1 Corinthians 15:34. And it says, "Awake to righteousness and do not sin. For some do not have the knowledge of God. I speak this to your shame." So friend, if you want to not be ashamed, you need to be spreading what you know, the good news that you know, that anyone who believes on Him will not be put to shame. But they will be put to shame if they don't believe on Him. And if they're foolish, because there's plenty of scriptures you can go to that show this to be true. Now, getting back to the theme that I am addressing in most of my recent videos, this prophetic theme, I thought it was interesting, the two places in Revelation that deal specifically with the word shame. One is to the Church of Laodicea, and I may do a series of videos on the churches. If you're interested in that, let me know. The 7 churches, because there's a lot to learn from those, and we haven't addressed that specifically. But Revelation 3:18 to that church is God's counsel to that Laodicean church. And that's often been said to be reflective of the culture today. And he says there, "I counsel you to buy from me gold refined in the fire, that you may be rich, and white with white garments, that you may be clothed, that the shame of your nakedness may not be revealed, and anoint your eyes with eye salve, that you may see." Now, much could be said more there, but the other place in Revelation is right before that verse that deals with Armageddon and the gathering of that. Go back and look at that video on Armageddon if you want to see more about that. But Revelation 16:15 says, in the context there, "Behold, I am coming as a thief. Blessed is he who watches and keeps his garments, lest he walk naked and they see his shame." And friend, there will be a lot of people ashamed in the future. If you just look at what I talked about with Babylon, wow, several different videos I did on Babylon and what that represents and the shame that would even come with that. But let me just get to this article because I addressed this subject pretty well in an article that God led me to write some almost 12 years ago now. So I wrote this on 9309, and it's called What a Shame. Instead of what a shame, what a shame. Okay, so here is what I said. Have you ever had something not work out like you thought? Maybe there was even something you did that prevented a project from going forward. Are there thoughts that you have had or things that you have done which you would rather others not know about? Think of how they would be disappointed in you. Think of how you would feel if they only knew. It would be a shame if others knew. Or would it? It is human nature to want to please others. Children are born with a desire to please their parents. What child has at some point not felt the dread of shame after disappointing their mom or dad? What child has not been caught doing something they knew that they should not have been doing only to feel the pangs of shame? Then children grow up. They go off to college or enter the workforce and are exposed to all sorts of tolerated behavior. Now, I might say, as I said earlier, in the home, if you tolerate too much misbehavior, then there will be a problem with the children not understanding the proper use of shame and the emotion that is and what God intends by it. But children go up and they begin to recognize all sorts of tolerated behavior in others. They watch the movies and see the television shows that continually push the envelope of what society will tolerate. As time goes along, more and more is not only tolerated, it is accepted. The feelings of guilt and shame grow faint or are lost. You don't have to worry about pleasing others anymore, or do you? Now, I address this on a broader scale here, but you think about this in reference to things that even psychology used to teach. Do you know that psychology used to teach that homosexuality or any kind of LGBTQ thing that anyone would identify with, do you know they used to teach that that was a shameful thing? And then they became more secularized and accepting and tolerated different views. And so now, along with psychology, much of culture has just become accepting of all these different abhorrent views and confusing identities that people try to say they are. But again, I'm dealing with this in a broader way here. So I said, when was the last time you recognized those feelings of shame? An increasingly permissive society protects you from that. I've done several videos relating to these things. I mean, it used to be shameful for people to be involved in fornication. But there seems to be very little shame with that now. For a woman to be pregnant before she was married, but that's not looked upon very unfavorably now. For women to dress in a provocative way, that used to be shameful. I mean, I've done videos on this. I've got that playlist on sexual issues that you could look at. But when's the last time you have had that feeling of shame? And society just seems to protect from that now. And I don't think it's a good thing. I asked that question, is it a good thing? Today, psychologists will often say that it is. That you don't need shame. You don't need guilt. You don't need to be bothered with feelings of guilt. That will just depress you. You just need to be educated so that you can grow beyond the guilt and shame. Does this sound familiar? Do you see where our enlightened society has come? Have you bought into this dangerous way of thinking? This is one reason why tragedies like 4/16/07 can occur. And that's that Virginia Tech shooting that turned my life upside down. It can occur because people have no shame. Shame is not a bad emotion. It is a bad feeling, but God gave it to us to remind us that He sees everything. Some do misuse shame, but this does not mean it should be avoided. Whether or not all those around you see or even care, God does see and He does care. God knows everything that everyone in the world is thinking and doing at any given point of time. Consider Psalm 94:9. He who planted the ear, shall He not hear? He who formed the eye, shall He not see? The Lord God sees and knows everything. He understands what you are thinking before you think it. He hears what you are saying before you say it. Lamentations 3:22 reminds us of His mercy. Through the Lord's mercies, we are not consumed because His compassions fail not. So, as I say next here, so what happens in Vegas does not merely stay in Vegas. It is all known by God and even being recorded, as Revelation 20:12 indicates. And since that is in our prophetic book that we are focusing on here recently, I thought it would be good to read that as I mentioned it here. And I saw the dead, small and great, standing before God, and books were opened. And another book was opened, which is the book of life. And the dead were judged according to their works by the things which were written in the books. So there are books being kept, and there will be shame if the works that you have done have not been forgiven and you are just judged by those works. So, I say here, one day each will give an account of his or her own self to God. And that's Romans 14:12. And that says that very thing. So then each of us shall give an account of himself to God. And the context of that is more for believers, but believers will still give an account of things that they've done. I say here, you need not worry about whether or not you please another, for you will not have to account for your neighbor, though you will have to account for your impact on your neighbor. So God holds each of us individually responsible, but He does hold us accountable for how we positively or negatively affect someone else. And then I say here in conclusion, friend, you may feel little to no shame when comparing yourself to others, but you will feel shame one day if you have not come to know God's forgiveness through Jesus Christ. Those who do claim to know Christ had best be abiding in Him. And that's the quoting of 1 John 2:28, which I quoted here and have often in these videos. And now, little children, abide in Him, that when He appears, we may have confidence and not be ashamed before Him at His coming. What a shame to not acknowledge this truth. Now, friend, it is a shame if you don't acknowledge this truth. And it will be to your shame if you do not understand that you need to believe on Him, that you need to trust Jesus Christ, because you will be judged by your works. You won't go to be with God by your works, because that is by grace if you believe on Him. You will be judged in heaven by your works for Him if you know Him. But if you've never trusted Him, you will be judged by every work you've done, as Revelation 20 said. So we all will give an account for what we do. And the question is, friend, will you be ashamed? Will you be brought to shame? I just hope you will want to not be shamed. I hope you will want to understand, as a verse that God has put into my mind and head and what I want to do, in Philippians 1:20, which says, according to my earnest expectation and my hope, that in nothing I will be ashamed, but that with all boldness, as always, Christ shall be magnified in my body, whether it be by life or death. And 21, for to me to live is Christ, and to die is gain. Now you won't be ashamed if you know Him and if you have that as your philosophy. Oh friend, like this video, share it with other people, subscribe to my channel, and be ready, hit that notification bell, and be ready for that next video where I talk about the bride being presented and that marriage supper of the Lamb.